The NBA in 2018 was crazy. The KD era Warriors were still dominating, but were going into what would be their final season. LeBron left the Cavs for the Lakers in the 2018 offseason. Kawhi also got traded to the Raptors that offseason, then won a title in his only season there. Paul George re-signed with the Thunder, which set up a massive domino effect when he was traded to the Thunders in 2019, which is directly connected to the 2018 NBA draft. A class that completely changed the league. It features an MVP, multiple All-NBA players, All-Stars, a ton of incredible depth, making it one of the best draft classes of all time so far. So let's go back and look at the league in 2018 and this draft all these years later. At first overall, we have Deandre Ayton going to the Phoenix Suns. When you go back in time to 2018, the conversation around the first overall pick was pretty interesting. As a prospect, Ayton was seen as a nearly perfect modern big with great size, mobility, and the promise of developing offensive skills that could make him a fantastic two-way player. And of course, they already had their star perimeter guy in Devin Booker, so this was an attempt to create a well-balanced roster between the backcourt and the frontcourt. And as unlikely as it seems now, given Ayton's profile as a prospect, this was a defensible pick at the time, if Luka Doncic hadn't also been in this draft. More on Luka later, of course, but it's just incredible that he did not go first overall, especially because the head coach of the Suns at the time was Luka's national team head coach. He had firsthand experience with Luka, and they still didn't select him. Now, obviously, an inexperienced head coach does not get final say over who the team picks first overall, but that's still an incredible detail. Ultimately, the Suns went with Ayton here, and although it became immediately clear that it was a mistake to pass on Luka, Ayton was pretty good in Phoenix. Statistically, he showed up and averaged 16 and 10 right away as a rookie, and over the years was pretty reliable. The big issue was defense, which wasn't really an athletic issue, but was more so just him getting used to playing defense at the NBA level. And once he figured that out, he was truly a valuable piece during two incredible seasons for the Suns from 2020 to 2022, which included a run to the 2021 finals where they lost in 6 games to the Bucks. The real issue for Ayton is the Suns were mostly asking him to be a role player around the, at the time, Chris Paul and Devin Booker core, and Ayton wanted to be a star. He's a self-proclaimed max player, a comment he made when he strangely said that he now has nothing left to prove in the league after signing that max deal, which I guess it's kind of true, but still is just a weird thing to say. And over the years in Phoenix, he just kind of wore out his welcome with his limited attention span on defense and lack of physical play. So in the 2023 offseason, he was sent to the Trailblazers as part of a multi-team trade that primarily sent Damian Lillard to the Bucks and also got the Suns Grayson Allen and Jusuf Nurkic in return. In Portland, Ayton was just kind of fine. The biggest issue was the lack of physicality and as a result, a lack of free throw attempts. It's pretty shocking how low his free throw attempt numbers per game were for a guy his size. And just like with the Suns, he quickly wore out his welcome in Portland, and they bought out the over $30 million left on his contract in the summer of 2025. And as of this recording, 7 years after the draft, Ayton is now on his third team and will be teaming up with his 2018 draft classmate Luka Doncic with the LA Lakers. Also, as needed throughout the video, I'm going to tell you guys where I have each of these players in a redraft, and right now I have Ayton slipping all the way to 9th in a redraft of 2018. Moving on now to a guy that will not be in the top 10 of the redraft, Marvin Bagley. If you thought it was crazy that one team passed on Luka, it was definitely crazy that 2 teams did, until you realized that the other team was the Sacramento Kings. As a prospect, Bagley was this incredibly athletic big that showed a lot of skills in college and was a high pedigree guy out of high school as well, ranked as the #1 player in the class of 2017 on ESPN. If you liked Bagley at the time, you saw him as someone that could develop into an athletic version of Chris Bosh, a skilled lefty that could play the 4 or the 5, space the floor a bit, and score effectively and efficiently inside. I, on the other hand, did not like Bagley at all at the time of the draft compared to consensus. I actually had him ranked lower than his Duke teammate Wendell Carter Jr. simply because he could not guard. Duke actually had to run zone a ton during his freshman season because Bagley just could not guard on the ball. And maybe even a bigger issue, the bar that you have to get to offensively to be a high impact big is just so high at the NBA level, and I didn't think Bagley would get there. To really justify giving a huge chunk of your offense to a big in the NBA, they kind of have to be close to the Embiid or Jokic level, and if they aren't that, They're going to be a lot like what Deandre Ayton was with the Suns and Trailblazers. And unfortunately for Bagley, all of those concerns came true. He never really developed beyond being a great athlete, struggled with injuries, and never found his true role in the NBA. After a solid rookie season, which was actually his best year in the league, he fell off after that and was traded to the Pistons after 3.5 years in Sacramento, then moved to the Wizards, then the Grizzlies, and back with the Wizards in the summer of 2025, where he will look to jumpstart what has been a very disappointing career so far. Now we get to the craziest part of the entire draft, both now and at the time, 3rd overall, Luka Doncic. This pick was originally held by the Atlanta Hawks, who were undergoing a full rebuild and desperately looking for a face of their franchise. The favorite to go 3rd in the pre-draft process was Luka Doncic, fresh off of an MVP season in the EuroLeague, the youngest player to ever win that award, and technically Luka did go 3rd, just not to the Hawks. The Mavs, who were picking 5th, made the aggressive move to trade up to 3 with the Hawks, giving them their 1st round pick the following season, in addition to the 5th pick in this draft. And it's really important to understand just how much of a risk this was for Dallas at the time. We see players in the top 5 become draft busts every single year, and using an extra 1st round pick to go up just 2 spots when they just had one of the worst records in the league, were transitioning out of the Dirk Nowitzki era, shows just how confident the Mavs were that Luka was going to be awesome. And of course, they were right, which gets into what people thought about Luka as a prospect at the time of the draft. I've said many times that I think Luka was the best international prospect of all time, and at the time of the draft, I said that he should have gone 1st overall. But there was skepticism around him as a prospect that revolved around 2 things. One was his athleticism, and the other was frankly just him being an international prospect in the first place. Everything about Luka offensively looked incredible. His instincts, skills, passing, improving shooting. But there were concerns about how he would match up with NBA level athletes in terms of his quickness, which was directly related to the other problem people had, just him being an international prospect. This was a time period in which guys like Mario Hezonja were going highly in drafts and not working out, so there was just concern and fear in general about drafting international guys highly to be your franchise player. But what I didn't understand at the time, and still don't, is how even if you had that concern, how you didn't realize how much better of a prospect Luka was than any of these other recent international busts. He was the MVP of a league full of grown men, the youngest MVP in league history, when all these other guys that didn't work out in the league were either playing in lower leagues or they were role players in the top leagues. It didn't make any sense then, and it doesn't make any sense now. But of course, the Mavs believed in Luka. They traded up to 3 to go and get him, and he was amazing right away, establishing himself as an MVP caliber player within a few seasons and giving the franchise a direct bridge from the Dirk era right into the Luka era, all leading to them making a run to the 2024 finals, just for the Mavs to inexplicably trade away Luka to the LA Lakers at the 2025 trade deadline in exchange for Anthony Davis amid conditioning and injury concerns. I still cannot believe that that happened. In a redraft, maybe somewhat controversially, I do have Luka 1st overall in this class over someone that we're going to talk about later. I think it's debatable, but I still think that Luka is the best player in the class, so he's going to go 1st in the redraft. Which brings us now to number 4 overall. And after the top 3 of Ayton, Bagley, and Luka, there was a lot of uncertainty with the rest of this draft, which was mirrored by the team that held the 4th pick, the Memphis Grizzlies. This was a time period in which the Grizzlies were moving away from the Mike Conley and Marc Gasol era over the next few seasons and were looking for new young building blocks, and they selected Jaren Jackson Jr. out of Michigan State. As a prospect, Jackson was this unique blend of skill and some floor spacing with elite defensive upside, but was not without his flaws. He didn't play as much in college as you'd expect for a guy that's a top 5 pick in the draft, 1, because his team was really good, and 2, he just couldn't stay out of foul trouble, which is a problem that has also bled into his NBA career. But the potential of what he could be if he developed was enough for the Grizzlies to take him at 4th overall here, a pick that a good amount of people thought was a bit of a reach. In the NBA, though, Jackson Jr. has continued to develop into one of the best defensive players in the league and has really grown offensively to become a foundational part of the Grizzlies' future alongside Ja Morant. And given all of the risks with this pick, I'd say the way that his career has gone has been pretty close to best case scenario so far. In a redraft, just because of the crazy talent of this class, Jackson actually doesn't move up at all. I have him at 4th overall. Next up at number 5 is the Atlanta Hawks, who, if you go back to 2018, were really just a directionless franchise. They'd moved away from the core of their 60-win team with guys like Kyle Korver, and in the 2017-18 season were led in scoring by guys like Dennis Schroeder, Taurean Prince, Nets, Kent Bazemore. Things were rough for that 24-win Hawks team, so they went looking for their next franchise player. Rather than stay at 3 and select Luka Doncic, the Hawks moved back, got an extra first-round pick, and selected Trae Young at 5th overall. Young was a really polarizing prospect because he was incredibly productive in college, was an incredible passer, but there were real concerns about how his size and lack of defense would translate at the NBA level. And although obviously they passed on the much better player by trading down out of the Luka spot, Trae Young has been a very good NBA player. He's been the hub of some really good offenses for Atlanta. They made a conference finals, and he's been a fan favorite the entire time. What would have really put this draft and this selection over the top for the Hawks is getting good value out of that extra first-round pick they got in the Luka trade, but unfortunately that didn't happen. That pick ended up at 10th overall in the 2019 draft, which they used to select Cam Reddish, who did basically nothing for the team. But even with that, yes, they lost the trade, but Young's been really, really good in Atlanta and looks to be the franchise cornerstone that they desperately needed out of this draft. But even given all that, I have Trae Young at the exact same spot in a redraft at 5th overall. Next up at 6 is the Orlando Magic, who were right in the middle of a real downtime for the franchise. They won just 25 games the year before and were led by a young Aaron Gordon along with Evan Fournier and Nikola Vucevic. So they were just looking for any kind of talent that they could find. They went with maybe the biggest upside swing in the entire draft, Mo Bamba. Similar to Jackson Jr., Bamba had a unique combination of skills where he could space the floor and protect the rim, except Bamba was bigger with a crazy wingspan and was a true 5, whereas Jackson Jr. was more of a 4-5 combo. And while he looked like he might have some other offensive skills, Bamba was basically just out there to dunk and shoot threes. It was a worthwhile risk for a Magic team that really needed an upgrade in terms of talent, but Bamba just never worked out in the NBA. He never developed into a true threat from three-point range, and although he was a good rim protector in theory, he struggled to understand positional NBA defense, lasting 4.5 seasons in Orlando without making much of an impact before ending up with the Lakers, Sixers, Clippers, and Pelicans, and as of this recording, he is unsigned going into the 2025-26 season. Next up, we get to the Chicago Bulls, who are where they always seemingly are in a draft, 7th overall. Not a joke, by the way, they picked 7th in this draft, then they picked 7th in 2019, then they picked 4th in 2020, but that was a draft that everybody knew was a 3-player draft, and they selected Patrick Williams 4th overall. But as we go back to 2018, the Bulls were a year removed from the Jimmy Butler trade at this point and had a core of guys like Zach LaVine, Lauri Markkanen, Chris Dunn, and Bobby Portis. A solid young group to build around, so they went with one of my favorite players in this class, Wendell Carter Jr. My comp for him pre-draft was like an Al Horford type player that just does everything really well. He could guard, rebound, score a little bit inside, hit a mid-range jumper, and he felt like a nice connecting piece as a prospect for the Bulls. Unfortunately for him, injuries were a big issue for him at the beginning of his career, and he just never developed a ton and never established himself as a core part of the very long rebuild in Chicago. So after 2.5 seasons with the Bulls, he was sent to Orlando in a trade package for Nikola Vucevic, as the Bulls were trying to jumpstart their rebuild and actually start winning some games. With the Magic, Carter has established a solid career for himself as a rotation and occasionally starting big, which does make sense given that his draft profile didn't project a ton of upside, which is why he went 7th overall. Next up is a perfect example of why I like to go back to where the league was at the time of the draft when doing these videos, Collin Sexton to the Cleveland Cavaliers. At the time this pick was made, LeBron had not yet signed with the LA Lakers. It was anticipated that he was going to leave the Cavs, but it wasn't for certain. The draft happens before free agency, so at this point, the Cavs were still trying to convince him to stay, which is why this pick was such a big deal. This was originally the Nets pick, which was sent to the Celtics way back when the Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett trade happened in 2013, and then the pick was moved to the Cavs when the Celtics traded for Kyrie Irving. And in theory, this was a selection that the Cavs could have used to go and get somebody else to help them try and compete and keep LeBron around, but ultimately they kept the pick and selected Sexton. And he actually said on TV after he was drafted that he hoped LeBron would stay, and then like 10 days later, LeBron signed with the Lakers in free agency. And as you'd expect, they were now looking at a huge rebuild. They went from winning 50 games and making the finals in 2018 to winning just 19 games in Collin Sexton's rookie season. So there was a lot of pressure on him to be the first step in the rebuild. And honestly, honestly, even though it's been a weird career, he's been a good NBA player. He was an interesting prospect because he was this super athletic, quick guard that could get to the rim and was a tenacious defender and competitor, famously in a game in which he played 3-on-5 for Alabama in college because they ran out of guys because guys got kicked out, guys got hurt. But his overall skill set as a lead guard was definitely in question. But during his time in Cleveland, he put up some crazy stats, including averaging over 24 points per game in his third season. The team wasn't that good, so they definitely seemed like empty stats a little bit. And then after an injury derailed his fourth season, he played just 11 games. The Cavs ultimately decided to move on from him as they transitioned to the Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell era, sending him to Utah in the Mitchell trade in the 2022 offseason, where Sexton continued to put up good numbers on bad Utah teams before being traded to the Hornets in the 2025 offseason after 3 years with the Jazz. Which altogether makes this one of the strangest careers in the entire class. A guy that's clearly talented, has put up some big numbers, but has never been on a good team, so it's hard to tell exactly how good he actually is. We move on now to our first true Summer League legend of the draft, Kevin Knox. The Knicks held the 9th overall pick here, and this was a tough time for them. They had a young Kristaps Porzingis, who they drafted 4th in 2015, but he was dealing with injury issues at this point, and they took Frank Ntilikina 8th overall the year before, who of course didn't work out. And outside of KP, they really did not have much talent on this roster. And they actually would continue to go into even more of a rebuild the year after this draft, trading Porzingis to the Mavs in the 2019 offseason, and of course selecting RJ Barrett 3rd overall in 2019. But back in 2018, they went with Kevin Knox here, who was a really interesting prospect. He played on a Kentucky team in college that really struggled with spacing, which was just not a good fit with his inside scoring game, but he still had a good year. He was an athletic combo forward with some upside that, if he could figure out how to shoot, really projected as a good player with proper development. Early on with the Knicks, he kind of looked like the steal of the draft. In his first summer league as a rookie, he was doing everything right. He was getting to the free throw line, he was attacking the rim, he genuinely looked the part. The problem was that was kind of the peak of his NBA career. He did have a solid rookie season, but an ankle injury slowed him down a bit. And after that first year, his lack of shooting just really prevented him from breaking into any kind of consistent role in New York. After 3.5 years with the team, he ended up with the Hawks, then the Pistons, Blazers, back to the Pistons, and then the Warriors. And as of this recording, he is unsigned going into the 2025-26 season. Next up is a really fun one, Mikal Bridges to the Phoenix Suns. Bridges was a really interesting prospect because he was clearly going to be this perfect complementary wing at the NBA level, but the upside really wasn't there, and he was a bit older as a prospect. This pick was initially held by the Philadelphia 76ers, and they actually did end up picking Bridges at 10 here, which was even more special because his mom actually worked for the team, so it was a really cool moment. They were excited when he got drafted there, and then not much later on draft night, he gets traded to the Suns for the 16th pick in the draft and an extra first round pick. The 16th pick in the draft was Zhaire Smith, who unfortunately didn't do anything for the Sixers, and the extra first became Tre Mann, but the Sixers traded that selection as part of a package for Tobias Harris at the 2019 trade deadline. This move in general was a huge miss for the Sixers because they were right about to really take off with those Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid teams, and the back-to-back off seasons of trading up for Markelle Fultz at 1st overall in the 2017 draft and that not working out, plus missing on a perfect complementary wing like Mikal Bridges in 2018 was really tough to recover from. In Phoenix, meanwhile, Bridges' refined game immediately made an impact for the Suns, and over the years he developed into a really good starting wing for them. And despite the mistake of taking Ayton 1st overall, when combined with getting Bridges, this class did set up the Suns for making their run to the 2021 finals. After that version of the team fell apart in Phoenix, though, Bridges was sent to the Nets as part of a trade package for Kevin Durant at the 2023 trade deadline, where on a worse roster and with more shot opportunities, his scoring really increased. Before the Nets then flipped him to the New York Knicks in the 2024 offseason, where he then signed a contract extension and is a critical part of a semi-contender in New York, all of which goes to show how Bridges is a critical piece of the great depth of this class. And for the first time in a while, we get to talk about the redraft. I have Mikal Bridges moving up a little bit to 6th overall in a redraft of 2018. And now we get to the biggest steal of the draft and the only MVP of the class so far, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He ends up being drafted by the Clippers, but this was initially the Hornets pick, and the Clippers moved up 1 spot, trading away 2 second-round picks in the process to get SGA. As a prospect, SGA played on that same Kentucky team with Kevin Knox, and as I mentioned earlier, the lack of spacing made made it really difficult to evaluate those guys. And for SGA specifically, that was probably a big reason why he fell to 11. It was just hard to figure out exactly what he was in college. He was a big guard with a long wingspan, but also had a smaller frame at just 180 pounds in college and didn't project as a great playmaking style point guard. And that, in addition to three-point shooting questions, made him a borderline lottery prospect. Upon getting to the NBA, though, it was clear the Clippers had something. They were transitioning away from the Blake Griffin era at the time and went into the 2018-19 season with that weird Tobias Harris, Danilo Gallinari, Montrezl Harrell team that actually won 48 games, and SGA was really solid as a rookie. It was especially interesting that SGA was such a big part of the team because Doc Rivers was the head coach, who was notorious for not only not playing rookies, but definitely not playing rookie point guards. After a good rookie season, though, the Clippers decided to make some huge moves, signing Kawhi Leonard in free agency in the 2019 offseason, and then trading for Paul George to pair with him, and SGA was sent to the Thunder in the trade. At the time, there was obviously excitement around SGA in the trade after what he showed as a rookie, but the focus was way more on all the picks that the Thunder got, and then over time, it became clear just how good SGA was going to become. His first year in OKC, they made the playoffs with him and Chris Paul and Dennis Schroeder all together in the backcourt before the team really went into a rebuild to build around Shai, which resulted in him just not really playing a ton over the next few seasons. They would shut SGA and other guys down mid-season in an effort to lose more games and get better draft picks, but all the while, SGA was one of the best kept secrets in the league until he and the team really broke out in the 2022-23 season, where SGA made first team All-NBA and finished 5th in MVP voting, which he followed up with a second place MVP finish in the 23-24 season, and then winning the MVP, NBA title, and finals MVP in 2025, setting him and the Thunder up to be the future of the league heading into the 25-26 season as of this recording. And this is really what elevates this draft class over others. If it was just Luka, Trae, Jaren Jackson, and some depth, that would be a really good class, but not necessarily a great one. But having an MVP in the class with the 11th overall pick takes it to a different level. And in a redraft, it's really tough, and obviously it's hard to argue against the guy that has the MVP and make him not the first overall pick, but in a redraft, I do think Luka's slightly better, so I have Luka first and SGA second. Which, as we go to number 12, makes it that much worse that the Hornets had the SGA pick and then traded him away. As I mentioned before, the Hornets moved back one spot, picked up 2 second-round picks, went to 12, and selected Mikal Bridges. The Hornets at the time were in a familiar place. They're pretty much always mediocre or bad, and in 2018, they were mediocre. They won 36 games with a roster led by All-Star Kemba Walker and also Nick Batum, Dwight Howard, and Michael Kidd-Gilchrist. And we didn't know this at the time, but Walker was actually going into what would be his final season in Charlotte, so they were desperate for some new young talent. One of the most athletic prospects in the class, Bridges was a really exciting pick here. The thought process for him as a prospect was that he would be a good scoring combo forward if he improved as a shooter, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. He's had a bunch of off-the-court issues, but has remained in Charlotte, and although he likely won't ever be an all-star, he is a good starter at 12 here. The biggest issue is obviously trading away SGA in the first place, and in terms of a redraft, I have Bridges moving up a little bit here at 8th overall. Next up at 13 now, as I cover all of the lottery picks, is Jerome Robinson. After a productive college career as a scorer, he became a late riser in the draft process because the Clippers front office loved him. He had good size and a ton of perimeter skill, but was never really able to get started at all in the NBA, lasting just 2 seasons and 113 games in the league. Moving up now to arguably the story of the draft leading up to it, Michael Porter Jr. Prior to going to college, he was one of, if not the best high school prospects in the country, an athletic two-way wing with fantastic size and crazy offensive upside. He was the full package as a prospect. He committed to Missouri, but played just 3 games there and struggled with a back injury that really concerned NBA scouts. The thought process was that he would still go top 10 of this class, maybe even top 5, but he fell all the way down to 14, where the Nuggets took a chance on. We've since found out that there were teams that just had him off of their draft board in general because of the medical issues, and some teams never thought he would play in the NBA at all. But the Nuggets selected him, and at the time, they just finished up year 2 with Nikola Jokic. And although pretty much nobody thought that he was going to become like a future multiple-time MVP, he was clearly something alongside of Jamal Murray. They won 46 games that year and wanted a young wing to grow alongside their core, so a high upside swing on MPJ made a lot of sense. Once he got healthy, he's been a really good starter for the Nuggets. Not the all-NBA caliber guy he might have been without the injuries, but a great shooter and at times explosive offensive player. The back injuries are still an issue at times for him, but this is still great value considering who else was left on the board, as MPJ would ultimately become a key part of the 2023 title team despite being massively overpaid on a max contract, and was then moved to the Nets in the 2025 offseason as the Nuggets look to upgrade that spot and turn him into Cam Johnson. MPJ's career to this point in many ways worked out better than expected given the injury concerns, and has certainly been one of the more interesting guys in this class. In a redraft, I have him moving up into the top 10 at number 7. Moving on now to 15 and Troy Brown. And honestly, the most alarming part of this section when making the video was not talking about the Wizards in a draft video until the 15th pick. I'm so used to them being bad, but in 2017-18, they were actually still pretty good. It was the last 40+ win season that they had as of this recording. Bradley Beal and John Wall both made the All-Star team, and then soon after this draft, it all falls apart, of course, as Wall gets injured. Not much to say here for Brown. The Wizards picked him, and though they thought he was going to be a complimentary 3-and-D wing with some athleticism, the three-point shot and offensive game just never developed, and although he did stick around the league a little bit, he has not made much of an impact. Next up now is the other part of the Mikal Bridges trade from earlier, Zhaire Smith going 16. The Suns originally held this pick, as I mentioned, but traded up for Bridges, and the Sixers went back to 16 because they loved Smith as a prospect. Then coach Brett Brown even made some comments about how he thought he might beat the next Kawhi Leonard, which obviously did not happen. And some unfortunate medical stuff actually caused Smith to never really get started at all in the NBA. A brutal trade for the Sixers, who, as I mentioned earlier, really could have used Bridges had they just kept the pick. Next up is one of my favorite sleepers from the class, Donte DiVincenzo. He ends up going to the Bucks with this selection, and this was a really transformative offseason for Milwaukee. They just won 44 games before losing in the first round of the playoffs, but then they moved on from head coach Jason Kidd midseason, and in the 2018 offseason, hired Mike Budenholzer as head coach and immediately took off, becoming one of the top teams in the conference around Giannis Antetokounmpo before eventually winning the 2021 title. So this was a really exciting offseason to be a Bucks fan when they took DiVincenzo. He was a good college player on some great teams at Villanova and was a late riser in the draft process, as his instincts and shooting looked like they would help him have a nice NBA career. He was solid in Milwaukee and actually eventually was the centerpiece of a trade that the league basically said the Bucks couldn't make because of tampering issues. It was supposed to be Bojan Bogdanovic going to the Bucks, but that just never happened. Later on, he was actually ultimately dumped to the Kings, and most recently had a nice comeback season as a rotation player for the Warriors and then the Knicks, before being sent to the Timberwolves in the 2024 offseason as part of the Karl-Anthony Towns trade. And as a mid-first round pick, he's a nice depth piece for this class and should have a long career as a floor spacer. Next up is pick 18, Lonnie Walker and the San Antonio Spurs. This was a really strange time for the Spurs because, as I mentioned previously, they were right in the middle of the whole Kawhi Leonard saga, and they ultimately traded Kawhi this offseason, but they were still a good team. They had LaMarcus Aldridge, a bunch of other vets, along with some young guys like DeJounte Murray and Derek White. And with Pop as head coach, it looked like if they could get good value for Kawhi, they'd be able to just keep chugging along. And although that didn't really happen because they got DeMar DeRozan in the Kawhi trade, who was good but didn't do much to raise the ceiling of the team, the selection of Lonnie Walker here was meant to just add another nice piece to their young core. He was an explosive college player with upside that could make him one of the best bench scorers in the league, but that just has not happened for him, simply because his game has not developed to that point, and defensively, he's a bit of a liability. He did manage to stick around on a few teams and have some really cool moments with the Lakers, but after bouncing around in the NBA as of this recording, he is signed to play internationally for the 2025 season. Next up at 19 is Kevin Huerter. At the time of this draft, when the Hawks selected him and Trae Young, people were throwing around comparisons as if these guys were going to be the next Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, which obviously did not happen. But Huerter's a really good shooter, and although he wasn't a long-term piece in Atlanta, has become a solid role player for this range of the draft. He was later sent to the Kings in the 2022 offseason, had some solid seasons for them and their fast-paced offense, then was dumped to Chicago as part of the multi-team De'Aaron Fox-Zach LaVine trade, and currently projects as a role player for the Bulls moving forward. Moving on to number 20, Josh Okogie and the Minnesota Timberwolves. The 2018 offseason was a really interesting time for Minnesota. They'd finally just snapped their super long playoff drought, coming off a really successful 47-win season behind Jimmy Butler and Karl-Anthony Towns, but what we didn't know at the time was that core, including head coach Tom Thibodeau, would only last 40 games into the following season. The draft happens in the summer. By November, Jimmy Butler has forced his way to the Sixers, and then everything completely falls apart. So there's a lot of pressure on this draft pick looking back on it now. What they needed at the time was a solid role player, and so as I said, they went with Josh Okogie. As a prospect, he was seen as a great defender, rebounder, and athlete, and although he didn't have a great offensive game, all he had to do was improve as a shooter, and he would be a possible starter in the league. He had some good moments in Minnesota, but putting a non-spacer out there on the perimeter makes lineup choices very difficult, and that has been his biggest issue in the league by far. He's since joined the Phoenix Suns and Charlotte Hornets, still struggling to find his place in the NBA. At 21 now is arguably one of the most hated players in the entire league at one point, Grayson Allen. He ends up with the Jazz, and this is a time period in which they were trying to compete with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, so adding a floor spacer like Allen with a ton of college experience made a lot of sense. He was a solid but older prospect out of Duke, mostly expected to fill a role as a really good shooter at the NBA level. The problem was, his career got off to a really slow start, and despite being drafted by Utah, he played just 38 games for them before being traded to the Grizzlies in a package for Mike Conley, where he steadily improved and then was traded to the Bucks after just 2 seasons there in 2021. He was solid for Milwaukee, then ends up with the Suns, as I mentioned earlier, as part of the multi-team Damian Lillard trade. And despite all the chaos that was the KD era Suns, Allen turned into a really good player for them, and despite all the craziness at the beginning of his career, has pretty impressively had a really nice NBA career so far. Moving on to 24 is one of the more interesting stories of this draft, Anfernee Simons. He goes to the Portland Trail Blazers, and this is right at the peak of the Lillard and McCollum teams. They just won 49 games, and the season after this draft, they won 53 games and made the conference finals. And they were looking for another guard to develop behind Lillard and McCollum to help with scoring off the bench and grow as these guys got older. Simons was a weird prospect though, because he didn't play in college. He took a year at IMG Academy, but was still good enough to go in the first round. He was seen as an explosive athlete with great scoring skills, but size was a concern. The Trailblazers took him, as I said, to be a good guard off the bench and then grow into a guard of the future for them, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. Although he still has issues as a player, mostly the fact that he is one of the worst defenders in the entire league, he's still a really good pull-up three-point shooter and an explosive scorer. But as the Trailblazers moved into more of a defensive identity, they decided to move on from him, and he was traded to the Boston Celtics in exchange for Jrue Holiday as we head into the 2025 season. Speaking of the Celtics, we skip ahead a little bit to their pick at 27, Robert Williams. As I mentioned before, this was the Kyrie era for Boston. And of course, they had vets like Al Horford and Marcus Smart, along with developing young players Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. The season prior to this draft was actually the first year of all those guys together, along with Gordon Hayward, who unfortunately, after signing a max contract in free agency, played just a few minutes for the Celtics that season before having that terrible injury on opening night. But regardless, the future was bright in Boston, and they needed frontcourt depth, thus the selection of Robert Williams. There were points in the draft process where it looked like he was going to be a lottery pick, but injury concerns caused him to drop to the bottom of the first round. He was a great athlete and rim protector as a prospect, and everything about that is translated to the NBA for Boston. Unfortunately, so have the injury issues, so even though at points this looked like great value here at 27, after a breakout season, the 21-22 season, he just has not been able to be consistent at all. He's since played less than 100 NBA games due to injury, even after being moved to the Trailblazers in the first Jrue Holiday trade in the 2023 offseason. Which brings us to the second round, and more specifically, one of the best second round picks of all time, Jalen Brunson at 33rd overall. He ends up going to Dallas, and we already talked about where Dallas is at the time of the draft, and it's unbelievable that they ended up with both Brunson and Luka in the same draft. But despite how good Brunson is now, it took some time for his NBA career to get going. He was a great college player, but his limited size and lack of explosive scoring ability made his NBA ceiling pretty low for most people. Him being a good bench guard made sense, all of which is why he fell to the second round, but what he's turned into is something way more than that. After 4 seasons in Dallas where he improved every single year, culminating in a breakout 21-22 season in which he averaged over 16 points per game, Brunson entered 2022 free agency as one of the most interesting players on the market. It was clear that he was good, but with Luka taking so much of the on-ball reps, it was hard to tell just how good he was and how much he was worth on a new contract. The Knicks were the team that stepped up and offered him a huge deal, big enough that the Mavs decided not to match it and just let him walk, which obviously turned out to be a massive mistake. Since going to the Knicks, Brunson has developed into one of the best guards in the league, making multiple All-NBA teams and completely changing the direction of the Knicks franchise. An incredible career arc for a guy that didn't do a ton in his first few years in the league and was picked 33rd overall. Unsurprisingly, Brunson makes by far the biggest leap in the redraft, going all the way up to 3rd from 33rd overall, behind only Luka and SGA. Next up is one of the most interesting prospects in the entire class, Mitchell Robinson, who ends up going to the Knicks here at 36. Robinson was the super athletic rim protector as a prospect, but actually didn't play at all in college despite being a high school All-American. He initially committed to play at Western Kentucky, but left before the season, and rather than sitting out a year to transfer, spent the year working out and entered the 2018 draft, all of which is why he ends up in the second round. Once he got to the Knicks though, his physical ability was clear. His crazy wingspan, great instincts defensively, all of which he used to be a really nice player for the Knicks. And in a redraft, he actually sneaks right into the top 10 at 10th overall. And then as you finish out the second round, you've got some other productive players, guys like Gary Trent, Jared Vanderbilt, Bruce Brown, DeAnthony Melton, Keita Bates-Diop, and even some undrafted guys like Duncan Robinson, Haywood Highsmith, Jacques Landale, all of which have been good to great rotation players, which really solidifies the depth of this incredible draft class.